Hi, in this lecture, I want to take a moment and address something that a lot of Photoshop users don't know. At the top of our Layers panel, we have Opacity 100% and Fill 100%. The question is, what's the difference between the two? I have these two identical layers on my canvas, and I'll drag down the opacity, so say 60% for this one. I can type in that value manually and hit Enter. As you see, the shape becomes semi-transparent. I can also adjust its opacity by clicking once in this field. Now I'll hold Shift while I use my mouse scroll. The value changes in 10 pixel increments. Remember that Shift does the same thing when you want to move your layers by 10 pixels. So this is slightly faster, but the absolute best method of changing your opacity is the following. I'll press Enter to commit this value, and now I'll tap 2 on my keyboard. As you can see, the opacity is now set at 20%. If I press 5, it's going to jump to 50%. Please be aware that 0 takes it back to full opacity. But if you tap something like 2.5 fast, you'll get 25%. Okay, this is great stuff. Now let's get back to our topic. Let's move over to the other layer and turn down its fill to 25%. There you go. The problem is there's no apparent difference between the two. This one has its opacity turned down to 25%, while this one has its fill set at 25%. I've interviewed well over 100 designers for my Android business, and the vast majority couldn't explain the difference. Well, here it is. I'll click on this small FX icon at the bottom of my Layers panel, and I'll enable a stroke. We haven't covered this subject yet, but we'll get to it a bit later. Anyway, I'll add a fairly large red stroke. Now, I'll drag the fill all the way down to 0%. Look at what happens. This controls the transparency of the layer itself, but not its layer style. That means our stroke isn't affected at all by the fill value. On the other hand, if I repeat the process on the other shape, you'll see the stroke is semi-transparent, as is the layer itself. And as I adjust the opacity level, both the layer and its stroke are equally affected. If I drag it all the way down to 0, you'll see it will completely disappear from the canvas, while the other one, even though it has its fill set at 0%, is still visible through its red stroke. This opens up a world of possibilities for your projects, so much so that Adobe introduced it a long time ago. So that's the difference between opacity and fill. Opacity affects the transparency of the entire layer, including its layer styles, while fill only works on the layer itself, not on its effects. Finally, I want to clear up any potential confusion. There's another term in Photoshop that's referred to as fill. I'll select my background layer so I can show you. Go to the top menu and click on Edit. From this list, choose Fill. This is a command that allows you to cover the entire layer with any color you want, hence the term fill. From this drop-down, you have several options, the most important ones being these two: foreground color, which is this top square here on the left panel, or background color, which is the one at the bottom. If I choose the first one, we'll get a black layer because that's the current foreground color. But if you want to obtain the same result without going through the menu systems, you can do the following. First, let me get a nice blue for my foreground color. Click once and you can play around in this new window. Okay, this seems fine. Next, I'll press X to swap these two. I'll click, and from this color picker, I'll choose a yellow shade. Great. Now for the hotkey. Control-Delete fills my layer with the background color, in this case that's blue. And Alt-Delete does the same thing, but it uses my foreground color. Here it's yellow. Why did Adobe choose the Delete key? Well, you can think of it as deleting all your pixels and replacing them with your desired color. So Control-Delete and Alt-Delete are the two hotkeys that can fill your layer with your background or your foreground colors. If for whatever reason you can't get it to work, create a new layer first and then try the commands. And that wraps it up. I hope you won't confuse the two terms as their names are similar, but they do completely different things. One controls layer transparency, while the other paints your canvas with your foreground or your background color.